From NPR and WBUR Boston, I'm David Folkenflik, and this is On Point. A week on edge as Iran retaliated for the U.S. killing of a top general by sending a wave of missiles to hit bases housing U.S. troops. No one died. It was interpreted as a measured response, and President Trump did not further escalate the conflict. Yet Trump still had choice words for Iran in his national address.
As long as I'm president of the United States, Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Good morning.
Congressional Democrats have called for a check on the president's ability to act on his own authority toward Iran, and even some prominent Republicans lashed out at the administration. Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky told CNN the Senate should get to decide whether Trump should be given that authority.
Nobody in their right mind with a straight face, with an ounce of honesty, can argue that when Congress voted to go after Saddam Hussein in 2002, that authorized military force against an Iranian general 18 years later.
We'll have our Reporters Roundtable on all that and more this hour. First, we wanted to talk with a senior lawmaker familiar with decisions about armed conflict and whether to commit American troops to war. Joining us now from Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, is U.S. Senator Patty Murray. She's a Democrat who represents Washington State. She voted against the war authorization to invade Iraq in 2002, and she's one of the few lawmakers who did so who remains in Congress. She's also one of the senior Democrats in the leadership of the United States Senate. Senator Murray, thanks so much for taking the time to add context to this week's news.
Thank you. We made it at this really serious time of our country for having a thoughtful discussion.
Appreciate it. So let's talk a little bit, just take a moment to frame this in context. What is different about the nature of the discussion about the confrontation and possible conflict with Iran than occurred nearly 2 decades ago over the subject of Iraq and Saddam Hussein?
Well, when we were discussing this 18 years ago, the president came to Congress to present his reasons and testimony and all of what he felt were facts about the facts on the ground to ask for our authority to go to war. Mm-hmm. This is a very different time. The president tweeted to us after he had made a very dangerous decision to say that this was his intent. That is not how our country should ever put our men and women's lives at risk, our economic security, and the future of this country.
Obviously, you've had to think hard about this issue in the past. You know, a number of the folks who voted the opposite way from the way you voted back in 2002 in anticipation of that invasion the next year came to regret it, the late Senator John McCain among them. There are folks who are in Congress or in Senate right now who may oppose you on the question of the nature of our interactions with Iran, who nonetheless are expressing concerns equally about the way in which the administration has behaved. Why is that?
Well, it is a very serious discussion when you talk about putting American lives at risk. We are asking men and women to go to war, and we have seen in this what happens to soldiers when they go to war and their families, what happens to them in the immediate, both mental and physical wounds of war, loss of life, families who've had to deal with it, what happens to them when they come home and try to get back into a civilian life and a job, the cost to our country. So when you take a serious step like going to war provocatively, you have to answer all those questions before you go. I remember when we were looking at all of the data and everything that was being presented to us when we were asked to go to war in Iraq, and questioning whether or not it was accurate. Today, we're not even being given any information that says that there is any backing to what they are asking us to do. This is serious.
Senator Patty Murray, you don't have to name names, but take us behind closed doors. Take us into the room. When you talk to Republican colleagues about not just Democrats who have been openly critical of the Trump administration on a variety of lists, but Republican colleagues, as I'm sure you do, about the way in which this administration, particularly this president, has handled this confrontation, even as tensions have subsided in recent days. How do they characterize their trust in the administration's handling of this high-stakes drama?
Well, there certainly are people on both sides who have an immediate reaction one way or the other. We are in a very partisan time. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of thoughtful members on both sides, Republican and Democrats, who understand the consequences of an action like this, short-term and long-term. And let me take you back again to when we were discussing the war in Iraq. And there were people in the room who were saying to us, oh, America's power is so great. This war will be over in 5 days. We will overpower them. Look what history has taught us. There are members there today who understand that and know that making a decision like this by a tweet or by an overreaction or by being bellicose about it can cost our country lives and its economic stakes far into the future.
And Senator, one of the questions I have is certainly the strong majority of your colleagues, if I recall correctly, supported authorizing the Bush administration to press towards that invasion of Iraq. You know, we've been at war for so long now, since really the strikes on Afghanistan in the fall of 2001 in the wake of 9/11. We've basically been in, what's been called this forever war. Is there the feel that people don't trust this administration to pursue military conflict, or is there the sense more broadly that your colleagues in the Senate are just deeply fatigued, as the nation is, of being in this constant state of military conflict?
I think it's both. And I think that both of those need to be considered. You need to trust the man at the top that he is going to make the right decisions for the country thoughtfully, smartly, wisely, and have people around him who can advise him of all of the consequences, short-term and long-term. There is a concern about that right now. And I think that is also in the nation, as you talked about, the weariness of having been at war for 18 years adds to that belief and mistrust that you can go into the Middle East, a very complicated region, take action, and assume you're going to be out in a few months. So that goes back to the question of what are the goals of this action and putting our military in a conflict in a very serious way, and our families. And that has not been outlined. Certainly we all want peace in the Middle East. It is a goal we need to achieve. How do we get there? By killing a general and bragging about it on a tweet? Or do we do it by using our allies and everyone in the region to try and bring calm to this and to solve the problems as much as we can through a diplomatic urgency?
We've been hearing there the words of Senator Patty Murray. She's a top Democrat in the United States Senate. Senator Murray, we appreciate your time so much today.
Thank you.
We should also note we also invited several leading Republican senators on the show for their insights as well. So let's pick up where Senator Murray leaves off. Our roundtable brings in a lot of expertise and insight. Joining us here by phone in New York City is Farnaz Fasihi. She's a journalist who writes about Iran for the New York Times, and she's an experienced former conflict correspondent at the Wall Street Journal. Thanks for joining us today, Farnaz.
Thank you for having me.
And with us from Washington, D.C. is Weijia Jiang. She's a CBS News White House correspondent. Weijia, we're so glad to have you join us today.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to be with you.
And, of course, from Hanover, New Hampshire, On Point's own news analyst Jack Beatty joins us. Hello, Jack.
Hello, David.
So only a little bit of time before the end of our first segment here, but I wanted to turn to you, Farnaz. You're so experienced covering not only the Middle East, but Iran in particular, a land with which you have ties. One of the things that fascinates me in listening to Senator Murray is thinking about the fact that here's a country that has acted to sponsor terrorism against Americans. The Iranian general who was killed is somebody who's responsible for a lot of deaths around that region, a lot of mayhem. And yet at the same time, we had been, in some ways, we'd reached diplomatic accords with the Iranians. We had been relying on that same general in some ways to fight ISIS. And even now, a poignant touch, in the wake of this passenger airliner that appears to have been struck mistakenly by the Iranians. They've allowed the American NTSB to come in and to help investigate what occurred. It seems as though there are these entanglements and involvements with the Iranians, even as it's a country that we, with understandable cause at times, attack for sponsoring terrorism.
Well, Iran and the U.S. have had these kind of entanglements and relationships going back all the way to the aftermath of 9/11, even as far back as that when the U.S. was about to invade Afghanistan. Iranians shared the intelligence that they had on the Taliban and Afghanistan with the U.S. And over the years, yes, the public posturing and the regime in Iran is very much anti-American. But Iran is not North Korea. Iran is not a closed-off state with no relationship with others. It's got a very dynamic population. It's in the middle of a very strategic region for the United States. It has control over the Strait of Hormuz, where most of the world's energy ships through. And so there's a lot of reasons for Iran and the U.S. to try to work with each other and reach some sort of a diplomatic accord. It's a very, of course, there's a lot of hurdles. There's a lot of ideology and on both sides, I think, from both the U.S. and in Iran. Ideologically, there are a lot of people who don't support that. But in reality, we've seen from the fight to ISIS to the war on terror and many different things, there have been instances where they've had to actually work together.
You're hearing
through allies. I'm sorry, I should point out that many times through allies in the region or through Europeans.
Sort of a diplomatic and indirect collaboration with those that we see in some ways as our foes and our enemies. You're hearing there from Farnaz Fasihi of the New York Times. We'll be picking up this conversation again. WeekIBUR Zhang of CBS, Jack Beatty, stick around. We'd like all of you to stick around. We're going to be talking about crises at home, crises abroad, a fraught week, folks. We'll be talking more about this U.S. confrontation with Iran, what might lie ahead, and the fight over impeachment. We'd like you to join our conversation. The threat of war appears to have subsided. How do you now feel about President Trump's decisions in this crisis? I'm David Folkenflik, and this is On Point.
NPR's Life Kit wants to help you make changes that actually stick this new year. From how to do dry January to how to start a creative habit. We've got new episodes all month to help you start the year off right. New episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. Listen and subscribe to Life Kit.
This is On Point. I'm David Folkenflik. We're talking about a tense week with a high wire act internationally and domestic political crises here at home. Arguments over war powers, arguments over impeachment. You can join our conversation. Follow us on the Twitters and Facebook at On Point Radio. We have, as ever, a superstar and super sharp panel of guests with me this hour. Farnaz Fasihi with the New York Times, WeekIBUR Zhang from CBS News, and our own On Point news analyst, Jack Beatty. WeekIBUR, you cover the White House. I want to play for listeners a clip of how President Trump addressed the question of Iranian missile strikes on Iraqi bases housing U.S. forces. The president delivered these televised remarks from the White House on Wednesday.
As we continue to evaluate options in response to Iranian aggression, the United States will immediately impose additional punishing economic sanctions on the Iranian regime. These powerful sanctions will remain until Iran changes its behavior.
WeekIBUR, I want to get to a congressional response in a moment or two. But first I want to get to the question of what seems like the de-escalation of what had been a pretty intense crisis. What is, as you understand it, the thinking of senior officials, and what is, as we all know, the most important thing, the thinking of the president, or at least the instinct of the president, in the last few moves we've seen from the White House?
Well, before Iran retaliated, there was certainly a lot of tension within the White House and administration because we were all waiting to see exactly what it was going to do in response to the killing of General Soleimani. And so you had President Trump coming out with very firm words saying if Iran did anything that they shouldn't be doing, that they would face even more consequences. And so it seemed that he was prepared and ready to launch yet another attack. In fact, he rolled out members of his secretary, top military commanders to speak publicly, issuing the same very clear message that the U.S. is ready to respond again. And so there was this rush of relief when the president was able to announce that there were no casualties, that no soldiers had been killed. And, he even tweeted before those public remarks that all is well. The problem is that even though he's able to declare this victory and with the appearance of de-escalation, this is far from over. Just hours after the president made those remarks and told American people that they should feel extremely grateful and happy for Iran's relatively tame response, his own FBI and Department of Homeland Security issued an intelligence bulletin to law enforcement agencies warning that Iran could act through an attack on U.S. cyberspace, that they have made assassination threats before, and certainly perhaps most importantly, that they could act through their proxies like Hezbollah. And so even though the president right now is claiming this win, is saying that he was able to, take down one of the most dangerous men in the world, even though he's saying that, we don't know yet. And that is why so many members of Congress, that is why his critics are still worried about what's to come.
Jack Beatty, I want to play a couple of clips for you and for our listeners about the question of the nature of the threat and the nature of the administration's response. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made the case this week for the decision to kill Qasem Soleimani. That is this figure, this Iranian general who is, head of special forces, an intelligence figure, one of the most important people in Iranian government, but also designated by the U.S. as a terrorist. And Mike Pompeo made this case, Secretary of State, because of what he called an imminent threat that Soleimani posed. Take a listen to what Pompeo said at a press conference Tuesday in Washington.
So if you're looking for imminence, you needn't look no further than the days that led up to the strike that was taken against Soleimani. And then you, in addition to that, have what we could clearly see were continuing efforts on behalf of this terrorist to build out a network of campaign activities that were going to lead potentially to the death of many more Americans. It was the right decision. We got it right.
This morning on Fox News, Pompeo said, quote, "There's no doubt there were a series of imminent attacks being plotted. We don't know precisely when, we don't know precisely where, but it was real." Interesting definition of imminent. Now, I want to pair that, Jack, with the comments of Republican Senator Mike Lee of Utah. He emerged fuming from the briefing earlier this week with administration officials about all that's going on toward Iran. Lee said that the briefing was so inadequate, it made him decide to join Democrats in supporting a call for new legislation requiring there to be authorization of war.
The briefing lasted only 75 minutes, whereupon our briefers left. This, however, is not the biggest problem I have with the briefing, which I would add was probably the worst briefing I've seen, at least on a military issue, in the 9 years I've served in the United States Senate. What I found so distressing about that briefing was that one of the messages we received from the briefers was, do not debate, do not discuss the issue of the appropriateness of further military intervention against Iran. And that if you do, you'll be emboldening Iran. The implication being that we would somehow be making America less safe.
Lee also said that the Trump administration officials refused to say whether the president would require or need congressional approval to order the killing of Iran's supreme leader. Killing a head of state is considered a classic act of war. Jack Beatty, tell us the state of affairs for the president, for the administration that you're seeing play out on the Hill, and how significant you think it is.
Well, President Trump is running right into the credibility gap that he has created with, according to the Washington Post, upwards now of 12,000 falsehoods he's uttered since being president. He claimed that not only was the attack imminent but grave. He said yesterday they were going to, quote, blow up embassies. No proof for that. An alternative scenario, you can see it in the Washington Post reporting, is that the president acted out of vengeance and to save face. The Post points out that he was particularly angry at seeing the embassy under siege, and when presented with options about what to do about that and about the killing of the American contractor, he went to the most dire, which was to kill Soleimani, but that his motive there was as much to show that he was tough after seeing the face-off in front of the embassy. So he doesn't have credibility. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy sent Adlai Stevenson to President de Gaulle with a folder carrying with photographs of the Soviet missile silos. Stevenson handed it to President de Gaulle, and President de Gaulle closed the folder and handed it back. And he said, when the President of the United States says there are Soviet missiles there, there are Soviet missiles there. Oh, that's as far from us as Rome today with the President and his credibility. And he's running right into it, even with, I think, some pretty brave members of his own party.
Farnaz, we've seen the Iranians issue this strike against these Iraqi bases I mentioned earlier where American troops are housed. But reportedly, according to authorities, no one was killed in those strikes. And the Iranians said this is as much as we're intending to do unless there's further attacks. In a sense, they're saying we're going to do something to indicate that we're not going to walk away from the field, but we're not looking to escalate this. In some ways, the American government killed, in the words of many, assassinated a figure who was responsible for a lot of deaths and a lot of brutal acts in the Middle East. Did Trump judge this correctly? Did whether it's gut impulse, whether it's vengeance, as Jack points to reporting suggesting, is whether it's a measured conclusion, which seems unlikely, always possible. In some ways, did the Trump administration do something that may yield positive benefits, or are we not there yet? Do we not know what the full consequences will be?
I think the events of the past 48 hours in Iran and the region show that the consequences of an assassination have rippled very widely through the region. Iraq has voted to expel the U.S. military, which is extraordinary given how many lives were lost in Iraq. And the $3 trillion that the U.S. has spent to invade and stabilize Iraq, and 20 years later, it has created problems with allies who don't want to see a war with Iran. It also has led to the tragic, the collateral damage and tragic loss of the people on the plane. So it's been really a cycle of things that really show that you can take these actions, as we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan. U.S. may be a military superpower and it could attack a country and start a war, but how it ends up and how it ends and how it plays out is very unpredictable, and it can't always control that. Now, if we want to really examine whether President Trump's decision to assassinate General Soleimani had the intended benefit, we have to understand what is the end goal of the administration. I think this is something that nobody is not clear to neither Iran watchers or Washington insiders. If the U.S. wants to destabilize Iran, create regime change, it has done the opposite, because as we saw, millions of people came to the streets with the threat of war sparked a sense of nationalism in Iran. Mr. Trump's tweet that he was going to target 52 places in Iran, including cultural sites, really rallied Iranians behind the flag. I spoke to many Iranians who went to the funeral only because of that tweet, just to say, we don't want war with the U.S. You can't do this to us. Right. So if it were to get the population to rise up against their leaders, it did the opposite. If the goal is to de-escalate things with Iran and bring Iran to the negotiating table, that seems very unlikely now, because the fallout of the assassination is that the hardliners have strengthened, and people say President Trump is no longer for us the president who pulled out of the nuclear deal, who wants to negotiate a better nuclear deal. He will always be remembered as the president who assassinated General Qasem Soleimani, the number 2 most powerful man in Iran.
Let me take a couple of calls. We've had comments from people online. One commenter online said, surprised there's not a queue of comments that blame the president for the rocket attacks and internal Iranian domestic protests. We certainly can't accept that the Iranian mullahs and military brought this on themselves, can we? And others who talk about, as Farnaz just has, about the deaths in the airline crash, saying let's not gloss over the fact a civilian airline was shot down. This was not done by the Americans, but that, in fact, it is a result in some ways of the crisis, that there's evidence that this was a surface-to-air missile, at least cited by Western officials and the Canadian Prime Minister, fired by the Iranians at this civilian aircraft. I want to take a call now from Saeed, who's calling from Green Bay, Wisconsin. Thanks for listening, Saeed. What are your thoughts?
Thank you for taking my call. It's being overstated that this is causing Iranian national unity. Let us remember that Qasem Soleimani had no small part to play in the killing of Iranians. In 1999, the attack in the Tehran University dormitories, where they tossed students from the fifth floor of the building. Iranians remember Qasem Soleimani as a perpetrator of those crimes against Iranians. And not before, a month before this, Amnesty International said 1,500 Iranians were killed in the streets by these thugs that present themselves as a government in Iran. But the reason I'm calling is because many have spoken about the departure from the 5+1 agreement as a proximate cause of the current situation.
And Saeed, for our listeners, Saeed, let me just say for our listeners, he's talking about the agreement struck involving the U.S. among other major signatories that in which the Iranians, for lifting of sanctions, agreed to suspend the pursuit of any weapon-grade nuclear material. Go right ahead.
Yes, if you're a fair arbiter of that, and I would consider Thomas Friedman a fair arbiter of that. He was completely in support of the Obama agreement, but recently he published an article that said in Tehran, in Iran someday they will name a street after Trump because of killing Soleimani, because Soleimani was because if you look at what happened after the behavior of Iran following the agreement from 2015 to the present time, Iran got reintegrated in the world economic order. Their economy grew 10% the following year. They took that wealth and converted into bombs that went over the heads of people in Aleppo. They converted it to Iranian proxies fighting in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq. And none of this benefited the Iranian people.
All right, so let me thank you for that, Saeed. Very briefly, Farnaz, reflect that. The Iranian sentiment, often the people have been very in favor of the United States. Has this actually rallied them against the U.S., or is this a demonstration, perhaps, of anti-U.S. sentiment that it isn't truly reflective of the sentiment on the ground?
I think it's a mix. I think you definitely, as Saeed pointed out, have Iranians who do not hate General Qasem Soleimani and the policies that he represented and the military adventurism of the Islamic Republic and the brutality that's associated with that, both at home and abroad. But we have to remember that General Soleimani's role was very unique. He was in Iran's military apparatus. He was in charge of the Quds forces, which are an external force. And since the rise of ISIS, he was in charge of defeating ISIS and helping the Iran's Shia paramilitary groups in the region, particularly in Iraq, defeat ISIS. And that really is when he became a household name in Iran. And that's when Iranians started associating him and what he was doing with the fact that Iran had been able to remain safe and stable amidst a region that was ablaze in crisis and terrorism and car bombs. So I think the sentiment toward General Soleimani is really mixed. Mm-hmm. And from what we hear, at least we saw in the aftermath, even a lot of people who don't support the regime, who were not really keen on what the policies that the Islamic Republic pursues in the region, were angry at the U.S. because they thought this was going to be on top of economic sanctions that are hurting Iran, and on top of the travel ban. Now you're taking Iran to the brink of war.
So, Weijia, very briefly, let me ask you, and we're going to pop back up after this next break. But Weijia, tell us, you have Secretary of State Pompeo seemed very much desirous of striking Iran. At the same time, he's now saying let's de-escalate and find ways to work together across a diplomatic table. How does that work? How does the administration actually expect to do that?
That's a great question that I'm sure he'll be pressed with in just a few minutes, because in a rare press briefing, he is going to be talking to reporters at the White House in that briefing room that we all miss using so much. But, he has sort of offered a lot of different explanations for this and continues to contradict the president himself when it comes to justifying what happened. In fact, as you brought up, even though President Trump said that, Soleimani was going to blow up our embassy, Pompeo said that he did not know precisely when and where that imminent threat was.
It's a tension within the administration itself. We've been talking about all that. We're going to be talking about impeachment after this brief break. You can join our conversation. I'm David Folkenflik, and this is On Point.
Planet Money is the mountaineer economist behind the carbon tax. It's the baseball player trying to get a pay raise, the prisoner building a blockchain out of cans of mackerel. Planet Money from NPR. Listen now.
This is On Point. I'm NPR media correspondent David Folkenflik. In other news this week, Puerto Rico was hit by several devastating earthquakes. A 5.8 magnitude quake struck on Monday, followed by a 6.4 quake Tuesday. Hundreds of thousands of people lost power. One person died. Several were hurt. And in Australia, the devastation continues. More than 1 billion animals are now believed killed in the wildfires that are still ravaging much of the country. By the numbers, the fires burned over 12 million acres of land, killing 24 people and destroying more than 2,000 homes. My colleague Meghna Chakrabarti will be following up on that subject next week. Follow us on the Twitters. Find us on Facebook at On Point Radio. We have, as ever, a sharp and insightful panel, perfect for this week in the news, with Farnaz Fasihi of the New York Times, Weijia Zhang from CBS News, and our own On Point news analyst, Jack Beatty. Great to have you all here. Let's kick off with a call from Sarasota, Florida. Sharon, thanks for listening. Tell us your thoughts today.
My thoughts are regarding impeachment that Donald Trump is really just doing this Iranian attack for deflection of the impeachment process and to make him appear strong. Republican, and I think that I think that we really need to get back on track with the impeachment process and get this over as soon as possible. My other concern is that the Senate, of course, is just going to have a kangaroo court and just railroad this right through without really any due process and hearing all the evidence.
So forgive me, who do you think is going to railroad it through, Sharon? You think
McConnell,
that it's going to be
McConnell?
The Republican leader, Mitch McConnell.
Doesn't really care about. He doesn't really care about what Congress has already proven and stated and said he's been impeached. He just wants to go ahead and make sure that the process is quick and over, and the president is exonerated.
Well, thank you for that, Sharon. Sharon calling from Sarasota, offering that. I want to play a clip a little bit. A lot of this depends on, of course, what House Speaker Nancy Pelosi does, right, guys? Because Pelosi has yet to convey the articles of impeachment from the House, where 2 articles were passed, to the Senate, where a trial will be held. CNN is reporting today that Pelosi will not send over articles of impeachment today. Yesterday, House Speaker Pelosi said she wouldn't commit to a time frame to send those articles of impeachment over. She said she's been trying to negotiate with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell on witnesses, documents, and the process of a Senate trial.
No, I'm not holding them indefinitely. I'll send them over when I'm ready. And that will probably be soon. I just, he said, if you don't send them over, I'm going to pass the Mexico-U.S. Canada trade agreement. Okay. But no, we want to see what they're willing to do and the manner in which they will do it. But we will not let them say, oh, this is just like Clinton, fair is fair. It's not. Documentation, witnesses, facts, truth. That's what they're afraid of.
Weijia, that said, some House Democrats are starting to say it's time to proceed, and Mitch McConnell says he has enough Republican support to continue for now anyway with the trial once receiving those impeachment counts without making concessions to Democrats. What has this play been by Pelosi, or better yet, what has it accomplished, the question of her withholding these things until more events have played out a bit?
Well, it's given the White House another round of ammunition. They're actually relishing in this delay because they believe it bolsters their argument that this was all just a political sham. And they point to the fact that Democrats, including Pelosi, and certainly Intelligence Chairman Adam Schiff, that they were so eager to expedite the House proceedings because, as Schiff said, there was a clear and present danger, and that if Congress didn't act, the president could continue to engage in this bad behavior. So now you have this delay, and sources at the White House tell me, look, this shows that Pelosi was just concerned about how this could impact political races in 2020, and now she is seeing that it could have real consequences, and so that's why she's hesitating. And so the White House claims they're ready, that they're locked and loaded, and that they have their defense strategy, for President Trump in place and ready to go, and that they are eager to get this over with because they believe that the president's going to be exonerated in the end based on simple math.
Well, simple math would seem to support him in the Senate, Weecha, but you're a shrewd reporter. It seems as though this White House consistently comes out and says everything's going to come out roses. This is going to be awesome. Like, we have this in hand. Sure. And then your reporting and the reporting of others a few days later shows that it's madness underneath when you lift up the rock and see what's happening underneath, right? Is this them saying, oh, please throw me into that briar patch? We'd love it if you keep delaying, if you keep playing politics with this and the voters will get that? Or is this them simply putting lipstick on a pig and saying, we got this thing. It's going to be thrown in our faces for all of 2020. We might as well figure out what best grapple hold we can have to fling some mud back at them.
Well, look, I mean, the president has already been impeached. And so the next question of whether he is going to be removed from office is one that they're not actually worried about. Again, because they don't think
because Republicans are in the majority and you need 2/3 to pass that.
Right. And they think that, frankly, an advisor told me that this case is not sexy. There's nothing sexy about this that will engage the American people in another round of proceedings, even though it is the Senate hearing, the Senate trial. They claim that there is already a fatigue because, we saw those hours and hours of proceedings in the House play out, and people have already made up their minds. And that's why I think the White House really believes it doesn't matter anymore, because they believe, those people who support President Trump will continue to, and that he'll be able to use this at rallies going forward, which he already has, by the way. I have attended plenty of rallies since, he has the impeachment proceedings started, and he really uses this to make the case that Democrats are trying to undermine the vote in 2016. And he urges, voters to make sure that doesn't happen in 2020. So I would say that because the president has already been impeached and they are confident in what's going to happen in the end, that they really, even though the president is afraid that this will taint his legacy, they are not worried that it will have some serious repercussions for his current presidency.
And yet, Jack Beatty, things are playing out in the meantime, in the interim between the impeachment vote by the House and getting the Senate trial underway. Former Ambassador John Bolton, who served as the president's national security advisor and kind of bailed out after objecting internally to what was going on with Ukraine, the pressures on Ukraine from the president. He said in response to a court ruling that he would testify in front of the Senate if the Senate requested his testimony. And he might have some things to say.
Yes, his lawyer says he possesses new information, quote, that has not yet been revealed. We know on the record that he referred to the machinations of Giuliani et al. As a, quote, drug deal around holding the aid to Ukraine. And we know further that he gave a private speech some weeks ago in which he said that some of Trump's foreign policy decisions have been made in his own economic self-interest. And he instanced a vote, a question of over sanctioning Turkey over its buying Russian defense system. And he was saying that was the president was very much concerned with the effect that could have on his the Trump Tower leasing that he has there in Istanbul. That's a damning. If he gives that testimony, that's corruption. Will he give it? Well, it only would take 4 senators to join. 4 Republican senators could vote and to go forward with the subpoena. There are 4 that would have a reason to, given their political exposure. And then there's the other thing that if they don't vote to do that, David Leonhardt rightly suggests the House should subpoena him. Because if he said, I will take a Senate subpoena, there's no difference in law or logic between a subpoena from the House and a subpoena from the Senate. And they could subpoena him, so we could get his testimony that way.
That's fascinating. I want to ask you, Farnaz Fasihi, about some reporting in your former publication, the Wall Street Journal, that the president made the decision to kill Soleimani in part because he thought it would help him secure support from key Republican senators he needed to keep in line on impeachment. That is, these 2 dual crises, one international possible conflict, one domestic political crisis. One might be influencing the others. To the extent you can, to what degree does your reporting or your analysis suggest that one does influence the other in that way?
I think international decisions always affect domestic issues, and domestic issues always affect international issues. I mean, a country usually takes decisions like this as a whole, especially the United States. I mean, I can't speak to the reporting at the Wall Street Journal, obviously, because I'm not privy to.
I understand. You're at the New York Times.
Reporting. Yeah, I'm at the New York Times, rival publication now, but there are always consequences or gains or losses of a decision of this magnitude that I think that any administration would weigh when making it.
Mm-hmm. Let's turn now a little bit to the question of what's ahead for 2020. Jack Beatty, this morning, earlier today, jobs report numbers came out. They were a little sluggish. I think it was 145,000 new jobs were added, but this is at a time of incredibly low unemployment. The president, it's not clear who's going to win next year. It's not clear who the president's going to face, this year now. We're in 2020. It's not clear who the president's going to face in November. But tell us a little bit about what the economy suggests for the presidential campaign that is about to unfold in front of us.
Well, the news today caps a year of 2.1 million jobs created. That's the smallest annual increase since 2011, when we were crawling out of a recession. And the wage growth in this last quarter certainly has been anemic. On the other hand, the Financial Times poll yesterday reported that for the first time, a majority of Americans think that Trump's economic policies have helped the economy. Why is that important? Well, just a month ago, 44%. So if this is a trend, it's a trend that's ominous for Democrats. It's ominous in another way, too. The economic models that predict the president's victory, some by Mark Zandi at Moody's Analytics, some by Ray Fair at Yale, some by Oxford Economics, they all predict President Trump will win based on the economy as it exists and as they project it. But they have a sort of codicil, which is only if people give him credit for the economy. He is now He's now crossed that threshold. People, a majority, give him and his policies credit for the good times. The good news, possible good news, the opening for the Democrats is that only 37% of Americans in this Financial Times poll say the economy is better for them. Now, that's sort of an answer to the Ronald Reagan question. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? That's an opening for the Democrats.
I want to turn to one of the Democrats who has made it clear he is not the top polling Democrat, but he's going to stick around. Comedian and writer Larry David plays the presidential candidate and senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, on Saturday Night Live. On CBS's Late Show, Stephen Colbert asked Larry David what he should ask Sanders in a later interview. David says, actually, he's just sick and tired of flying in from the coast to do the show while Sanders stays in the race.
I would say I would beg him to drop out so I don't have to keep flying in from Los Angeles to do SNL.
Right, because he's doing very well this year. He's tied in Iowa. He's raised $36 million.
I thought when he had the heart attack, that was going to be it. I wouldn't have to fly in from Los Angeles. But, he's indestructible. Nothing stops this man.
You follow the 2020 race closely. The man in the Oval Office has a strong stake in what happens to the Democrats. To what do you attribute the lasting power of Bernie Sanders, and how significant a threat do you think he will be to Joe Biden to be able to try to figure out a way to run away with this?
Oh, I think he poses a real threat to Biden because he can make the case that he can get those voters that Biden cannot. And, the president has even said that Bernie was shafted in 2016, that he should have been the nominee. And, I think some voters still feel that way. And so, that's why he continues to have this power, especially from his base, that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. That's also why we see President Trump continue to attack him. In fact, last night at that rally in Toledo, campaign officials told us that we should expect the president to really go after Sanders, and he did. He's, also tweeting. His campaign is tweeting about Sanders, calling the killing of Soleimani an assassination, saying that, Bernie could not protect you, that it's the president that goes after bad guys and not someone like Sanders. And so he has real staying power. And I think that, perhaps that's, again, a residual pain from voters that they felt years ago. And I think that the fact is that people expected him to try again. And so now you're seeing this support. But, the big question is whether the establishment will support him as well. And so that's, of course, where Biden has points and these two will go at it. But I can tell you from the White House, even though the president says he wants to face Sanders, there is a real concern there because they, can appeal to the same voters.
Sort of very demonstrative men in their late 70s who you don't know necessarily exactly what they're going to say next. Weijia Jiang, White House correspondent at CBS News. We appreciate so much your time and your insights today. And thanks, too, to Farnaz Fasihi. She's a journalist with the New York Times who focuses so much on Iran and the Middle East. Thank you, Farnaz. We've also been joined by Jack Beatty's On Point's own news analyst. Jack, always a pleasure.
Thank you, David.
You can continue the conversation and get the On Point podcast at our website, onpointradio.org. You can follow us on the Twitters and Facebook at On Point Radio. On Point is produced by Anna Bauman, Justine Daum, Eileen Amata, Stefano Katsonis, Wes Martin, James Ross, Dory Scheimer, Alex Schroeder, Grace Tatter, and Adam Waller, with help from Carolyn Love, Bradley Noble, and Sydney Wertheim. Our executive producer is Karen Schiffman. Me, I'm David Folkenflick. You've been listening to On Point.